Rajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We are in the middle of discussing Book 2 of the Yoga Sutras. Today we'll be tackling, hopefully, Sutras 18, 19, and 20, pages 216 to 225 of Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Heads up for our not one, not two, but 3 Yoga Sutra classes in September. September 4th, September 11th, and September 25th. Those are the 3 in September. So our next class is Thursday, September 4th at 7:30 p.m. And the assignment is to read Sutras 2.21 through 23. So those 3 next sutras. And that corresponds to pages 225 to 232 of Edwin Bryant's book, Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Okay, so today we're discussing 2.18 to 20. If you recall, in the previous sutra, 2.17, what we were told is that the cause of all suffering is mixing up Purusha with Prakriti. We mistakenly identify with the body-mind complex, which falls on the side of insentient nature, and as a result, we suffer. In truth, in reality, we are a Purusha, an eternal self, pure consciousness, pure awareness, separate from everything in nature, and completely free from all suffering. And we suffer because we don't know that. We're ignorant of our true nature as Purushas, okay? That's what we were told in 2.17. Now, in 2.18, 19, and 20, 2.18 and 19 are explaining what is the nature of the seen, okay? So in 2.17, another way to put it, just using different terms, is we mix up the seer with the seen. We are actually, in truth, the seer. But out of ignorance, we mistakenly identify with the seen, objects of our awareness. Everything in nature, basically, okay? Okay, so now 2.18 and 2.19, sorry, I'm going to turn down the temperature here. I do this every day. It's always a little stuffy. Okay. 2.18 and 19 are explaining the nature of the seen, And 2.20 explains the nature of the seer. So you're following the sequence. 2.17 says we suffer because we mix up the seer with the seen. 2.18 and 19 say, here's the nature of the seen, nature. And then 2.20, here's the nature of the seer, which is our true nature. Okay? So, 2.18, this is a mouthful. Please repeat after me. I'll break it up slowly. Prakasha Kriya Sthitishilam Bhutendriyatmakam Bhoga Apavarga Artham Drishyam. Anyone who watches Patanjali's classes and talks, you'll know that one of his favorite texts is Drishya Viveka. It's the same concept. Actually, Advaita Vedanta owes a lot to Sankhya. It's strongly influenced by Sankhya philosophy and the Sankhya metaphysics. And this is one of the main things that it borrows from, that it borrows from Sankhya. This distinction between the seer and the seen. Drik in this Advaitic text means the seer, and Drishya is the same term for the seen. So in Sankhya, this Drishya is being explained as follows. And this is a long sutra. Okay, first of all, let's break it up. So, I'll just read Bryant's translation. That which is knowable, so that Drishyam, has the nature of prakasha, illumination. That corresponds to sattva. That means the sattva guna. It's referring to 3 gunas. Prakasha is the sattva guna. Next, activity. That is kriya, rajoguna, rajas, second guna. Third, sthiti. Obviously, the remaining guna is tamas. Okay, that's inertia. Okay, so all of nature is comprised of the three gunas in varying combinations, okay, different ratios. And further, the drishya nature is bhutendriyatmakam. Bryant's translation, it consists of the senses and the elements. The senses, the sense organs, and the elements, well, we talked about them before, so all the gross elements, okay? So earth, air, fire, and so on. And the final phrase is extremely important and very interesting. Bhoga apavarga artham. Nature, all of nature, even though it's insentient, according to Sankhya philosophy, even though nature is insentient, it has a purpose. And this is quite interesting, especially from the standpoint of like biology. Because even look at Darwin, right? Before Darwin came along, a lot of, especially Christian thinkers, thought that this world, look at it, it seems like it's designed in such a beautiful way, in such a perfect way, that there must be a designer at the basis, right? There must be a creator of this world. That's why everything seems to be designed in a certain way. And then Darwin comes along and says, no, we don't need to posit any kind of God to explain the beauty of creation. We can explain it through natural selection and the survival of the fittest and so on and so forth. And after him came a kind of refinement of the theory. How do you explain natural selection? It's genetic mutations, right? Like freak genetic mutations. And because of a certain genetic mutation, it's evolutionarily advantageous to a particular species or a particular kind of animal, and so they survive. And the ones that don't have that mutation, they die off. And so the fittest are the ones who survive, that kind of idea. So I bring this up because Darwin's evolutionary theory is, I think, a good example of explaining how nature can seem to have a purpose, a kind of overarching design, but without positing a creator God. And the reason why that's relevant here is because, remember, in Sankhya and Yoga philosophy, there's no creator God, at least arguably. The mainstream understanding is there's no creator God. If there's no creator God, what does it mean for this text to be saying that nature is for the purpose of what? What's the purpose? So let's read it. Nature exists for the purpose of providing either liberation or experience. Liberation is apavarga or moksha, okay? And experience is bhoga. Often bhoga in Sanskrit is understood as just as worldly enjoyment, but this is a broader understanding. It means experience in general. It could be extremely unpleasant experiences. It could be extremely pleasant experiences. This word bhoga here encompasses the whole range of worldly experience. Good, bad, ugly, neutral, everything, okay? So now, isn't that interesting? Insentient nature is designed with a certain purpose, but there's no designer. You see how Darwin is relevant here? I'm not saying that they would endorse Darwin and that Darwin would endorse Sankhya, but there's a similar problem here. You're claiming that there's a certain kind of purposiveness in nature, but you don't want to posit any kind of intelligent creator behind that nature. Okay? Sankhya doesn't say that. They say that everything comes from Prakriti in the end. And Prakriti, insentient, not God. Swami Vivekananda, interestingly, he's got a couple lectures on Sankhya and Vedanta, where he praises Sankhya to the skies and then says, but there are some problems. There's this lingering metaphysical dualism between Purusha and Prakriti. How do we resolve it? Swamiji says, you can't stop with Prakriti. You have to posit something behind Prakriti. You have to posit a creator God, Ishvara, that is responsible for Prakriti and then everything else coming out of Prakriti. But you have to posit a creator God. So now, within Sankhya and Yoga philosophy, though, there doesn't seem to be a creator God. So Prakriti on its own needs to be producing all these things. And so this is a genuine, I would say, question/problem. And I'm not the first to raise this. There's a scholar named Johannes Bronkhorst, Bronkhorst. He's a Swiss scholar, and he's written books on this, and kind of raising this challenge to Sankhya philosophy, which is you Sankhyaans are claiming that nature has a certain purpose. The purpose is to give experience to Purushas and to ultimately liberate them. How can an insentient thing like nature have a purpose? This is the difficulty. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we read Bryant's commentary and see how Sankhya and Yoga address this issue, if they do. And then there's another issue. Actually, this is one of the big elephants in the room that I've been bringing up, harping on throughout this class, but it comes up in a really big way in these sutras. Nature is for the purpose of giving experience to the Purusha and ultimately liberating the Purusha. But wait a minute, isn't the Purusha eternally liberated? The Purusha, according to Sankhya, is eternally liberated, nitya mukta. It doesn't need, it can't experience in a worldly sense because it's not entangled in this world at all. It's never subject to ignorance. And so why would Purusha need liberation in the first place? So it gets tricky. Now the word Purusha is not used in the sutra. It's added by Bryant to Purusha. But we'll find out in a second that traditional commentators also say the same thing. And it's explicit in the Sankhya Karika, for instance, which is one of the most ancient Sankhya texts. It says that all of nature is for the experience of Purusha and for the liberation of Purusha. And at the same time, the same text, Sankhya Karika, says that the Purusha is eternally liberated. And so it can never be bound. And it's not in need of liberation because it's already liberated. So these are some of the issues that we'll be discussing today. Okay, so Bryant, page 216. This is the beginning of his commentary on Sutra 18. Patanjali here describes the ultimate metaphysical ingredients of the seen, drishyam, the manifest world, and states its ultimate purpose for existing. See, already this indication that it has an ultimate purpose. Modern day scientists will ask, if something is insentient and there's no God, why do you have to posit an ultimate purpose at all? And in fact, what sense does it make to posit an ultimate purpose for something if there's no, if there's no God governing this creation in the first place? It could just be meaningless, right? Brute facts. So Sankhya doesn't accept that. It's this kind of unusual position. It accepts that nature has a purpose and yet doesn't posit a creator God. Okay. And then he explains the three gunas. I'm going to skip some. Let's see. Okay, page 217. Patanjali makes the important statement here that the purpose of these gunas, and thus of their prakritic productions, is to provide either experience, bhoga, or liberation, apavarga, for the Purusha, as indicated also in the Sankhya Karika. And it mentions specific Karikas from this ancient text, 17, 21, and 31. Experience, says Vyasa, so that's bhoga, consists of occupying oneself with the desirable and undesirable nature of the gunas, as discussed in 2.14. In other words, with pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. While liberation entails the realization by Purusha of its own true nature. Notice, liberation entails the realization by Purusha of its own true nature. There is no other reason for the existence of Prakriti. Okay, notice here, the realization by Purusha of its own true nature. This is suggesting that the Purusha comes to a realization that it's not the body-mind complex, for instance, right? But the problem, as I just said, is Purusha is never subject to ignorance, so it can never make that mistake in the first place. Okay? So we'll find in a second that Bryant, he addresses this, actually in the very next paragraph. He says, Vyasa then raises a very important question. Vyasa, the first commentator. How can either the experience or liberation noted in the sutra be imposed on Purusha? when they are the constructs and products of buddhi and exist only in buddhi and not in purusha itself. It's actually in buddhi, supposedly now. Now the terms are shifting. And Vyasa is saying that bondage and liberation is at the level of the intellect, on the side of nature, not on the side of purusha. And it's because of a mistaken identification between buddhi and purusha that we suffer. We mistakenly think that we're the body-mind complex. And because of that, we suffer. Okay. So why is experience and liberation being attributed to purusha rather than to the intellect itself? And then Vyasa uses a metaphor, an interesting one. Vyasa says, the laundryman is not the dyer of clothes. Although experience and liberation are concepts of intelligence, says Vyasa, they are attributed to the purusha because the purusha experiences their fruit. The purusha experiences their fruit, just as the victory and defeat of soldiers are attributed to their chief, even though he may only be witnessing the battle, because he experiences the fruits of victory or defeat. Okay, so this metaphor is very interesting, involving battle and a general, right? Where does it say this? Okay. So let me read directly from Vyasa's commentary. As victory or defeat of actual fighters. So imagine just two opposing armies, Kauravas, Pandavas, if you think of the Gita, for instance. As victory or defeat of actual fighters is ascribed to their commander, both have generals, right? Who experiences them, so bondage and emancipation being present in buddhi are ascribed to purusha, who experiences them. So Vyasa is likening purusha to the general of an army, okay? And let's say there are 1,000 soldiers on each side. And one side is defeated by the other. The general of the defeated side, we can say that General X lost, okay? He doesn't, what Vyasa is saying is he doesn't actually lose. I think that the metaphor actually is strained because he does lose in a sense. If he's the leader of the army, I think he loses. Whereas according to Sankhyan metaphysics, the purusha is completely separate from prakriti, actually, and is completely unaffected by what happens at the level of nature. So I think that there are some problems with this metaphor to a certain extent, but this is how he's trying to explain why is it that the experience and liberation that actually belongs to the buddhi on the side of nature, why is it that we attribute it to purusha? Because purusha is a kind of general in this army of soldiers within nature. That's the claim. So I don't think it's a very satisfying solution, but I just want to flag that they're very aware of the problem, these Sankhya and yoga commentators, and they keep addressing it, but as far as I can tell, never fully satisfactorily. Okay. Then, he says, Bryant says, 218, perception, memory, deliberation, critical reasoning, knowledge of the truth, determination, and indeed any cognitive functioning, all of which in actual fact are existing in buddhi, are superimposed on purusha, continues Vyasa. So again, notice this language of superimposition. Look at how much Advaita Vedanta borrows from Sankhya, because central to Advaita Vedanta is the doctrine of adhyasa, which is superimposition. We mistakenly superimpose upon a rope, which is actually there, a snake, which is not there. So this is actually from Sankhya as well, this idea of superimposition. So Advaita Vedanta gets that from Sankhya as well. We mistakenly superimpose upon buddhi something that is insentient, intellect, qualities like consciousness and so on. Okay? Other way around, sorry. So buddhi is superimposed upon purusha. Okay. Then, as long as the aware... I underlined this. So let me read it again. All these things, all these cognitive functions, perception, memory, etc., are superimposed on purusha. Who does that superimposition? Notice all the passive voice, grammatically speaking, this is all passive voice. high school teachers would not approve. But he uses this all the time, and I think it's because he's trying to avoid saying, well, who's doing, because that's the biggest problem in Sankhya philosophy, is who exactly is bound and liberated, right? Okay, so these cognitive functions are superimposed on Purusha. By whom? By Purusha himself? Can't be, because he's not subject to ignorance. By Buddhi? How can it be? Because Buddhi is insentient. And so again and again we vacillate between these two possibilities, neither of which quite works. Right? It can't be the insentient, it also can't be the perfectly and eternally free Purusha. Okay. Then Bryant says, as long as the awareness of Purusha remains focused on and is erroneously identified with Buddhi and its manifestations, Purusha remains as if bound by that connection. Purusha remains as if bound. Notice the as if. Purusha is not bound, but as if bound. To whom? Purusha is not fooled into thinking that it's bound, because Purusha is eternally free. Buddhi can't be fooled because Buddhi is insentient. Okay? Okay, I can't help but mention this, even though yesterday, as recently as yesterday, I already mentioned my book on karma and rebirth. I'm going to have to mention it again, but because it's quite relevant here. Okay, so for those of you who don't attend my gospel classes, a book of mine has just come out. It's called Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, Cambridge University Press. And you can get a free PDF online because it's open access, and you can get a hard copy here at the bookstore in a few weeks, hopefully. Okay, now, in one chapter of that book, I actually discussed this question. And I want to just read it out to you because it's just so that we have some precision in the discussion. Okay, so it's pages 13 to 15 of my book, so I'll just read it. So, a key question arises. What is the precise nature of the reincarnating entity in Sankhya and Yoga philosophy? The Sankhya Karika, the earliest extant scripture of Sankhya philosophy, gives a seemingly straightforward answer in verse 40. The subtle body, which is devoid of experience and endowed with dispositions, transmigrates. The subtle body transmigrates. This is the direct answer given by the Sankhya Karika. And the subtle body falls on the side of insentient nature. Okay. I'm skipping a little bit here. Okay. Now, in contrast to the Vedantic view that the reincarnating entity is the individual soul, the Jivatman, in association with the subtle body, Sankhya holds that the reincarnating entity is the subtle body alone. Remember, this is the thing I kept bringing up, is that there's no Jivatma in Sankhya metaphysics. There's no space for it. There's no room for it. Because there's just this metaphysical dualism of Purusha and Prakriti. Where does the Jivatma fall? Right? Okay. Verse 62 of the Sankhya Karika reiterates that Purusha is eternally liberated and therefore can never be subject to rebirth or bondage. Quote, no one is bound, liberated, or transmigrates. Rather, it is Prakriti in its various abodes that transmigrates and is bound and liberated. Prakriti here. So, Buddhi. So, what is it that's bound and liberated? Buddhi. Then I say, however, the Sankhyan conception of the subtle body as the reincarnating entity raises a host of difficult philosophical questions. In the context of Sankhyan metaphysical dualism, the subtle body clearly falls on the side of non-conscious nature, Prakriti, and it is difficult to understand how a non-conscious entity like a stone can transmigrate, be subject to bondage, or seek and attain liberation. The standard Sankhyan response to this difficulty is to claim that the conscious Purusha activates or illuminates the non-conscious subtle body and makes it seem conscious, even though the subtle body itself lacks consciousness. As verse 20 of the Sankhya Karika puts it, quote, due to the association of Purusha and Prakriti, the non-conscious subtle body seems to be conscious. Tat sanyogat achetanam chetanavat iva lingam. It seems conscious. This buddhi, even though it's insentient, seems to be sentient. Why? Because it's somehow activated by or animated by the conscious Purusha. And then I say, But how exactly can Purusha associate with Prakriti or activate or illuminate Prakriti if Purusha is always totally separate from Prakriti and does not interact with Prakriti in any way? What exactly does activation or illumination mean? And how is it even possible within the framework of Sankhyan metaphysical dualism? And to whom does the subtle body seem to be conscious when it is illuminated by Purusha? There only seem to be two options, neither of which is satisfactory. The subtle body cannot seem conscious to Purusha. Note, this is culminating in a reference to AI, so stay tuned. Okay, I hope it's not too boring. Okay, the subtle body cannot seem conscious to Purusha, since Purusha is eternally liberated and therefore never subject to bondage or ignorance. At the same time, the subtle body cannot seem conscious to itself, since it is hard to understand how a non-conscious entity can believe or feel that it is conscious. If beliefs and feelings are plausibly taken to be first-personal conscious states, then even believing or feeling that one is conscious requires consciousness. And then I have this parenthetical statement. In contemporary terms, a non-conscious AI robot might say, "I am conscious," but it can never actually believe or feel that it is conscious. So there have already been cases where people are interacting with AI and they ask AI, "Are you conscious?" And the answer is, thankfully these days, whenever I ask AI, it says no. But sometimes the answer is yes. But even if the answer is yes, the point is it's not actually conscious. It can say that it's conscious, but it doesn't feel that it's conscious because it lacks that first-person conscious awareness. Okay? Okay. So then, I conclude by saying, arguably then, the metaphysical dualism of classical Sankhya makes it difficult, if not impossible, to provide a coherent account of the reincarnating entity. So who is it that's bound and liberated? Purusha cannot reincarnate, since it is eternally free from bondage. On the other hand, Prakriti by itself cannot reincarnate, since everything within Prakriti is strictly non-conscious. Now, the modern Sankhya yogin Hariharananda Āraṇya attempted to resolve this dilemma by arguing that the reincarnating entity is the individual soul, the jiva, in association with the subtle body. It seems difficult to explain, however, where a reincarnating individual soul fits within the Sankhyan metaphysical scheme of an eternally free Purusha and non-conscious Prakriti. And in that little section later where I talk about Hariharananda Āraṇya in a little bit more detail, I point out that at the end of the day, what's his solution to this problem? He says, yes, the thing that's bound and liberated is the Jivatma. And then you ask, well, where exactly does that Jivatma fit in your scheme? He goes, it doesn't fit anywhere because it doesn't exist. It's brilliant, actually. It's a phantom entity. It's an illusion that the Jivatma, which is in bondage, which thinks it's in bondage, it's an illusion that it exists. Yeah, Suman, can you give the mic to Suman?
So if the AI agent can say, "I'm conscious,"
yes.
Subtle body also can say, "I'm conscious," right? Even though it is not conscious.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's also imitating. It's also just
Fine. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
But that doesn't answer the deeper problem or the deeper question, which is who feels bound and liberated? Who feels I am conscious, or who?
The AI avatar is also a phantom being. It's not a real being.
It's but not conscious. Right?
It's not.
It's real in the sense.
It's a phantom being, just like the jiva. And it can say that I'm feeling bound.
Absolutely.
And I'm feeling liberated.
Yeah, but there's no consciousness.
The electricity behind it is not feeling anything.
Right.
It's just animating it.
See, let's make this more concrete. You, right, in your life, you must have suffered sometimes, right?
Yes.
AI has never suffered in that sense.
No. See, let's say I program the AI to feel that it is suffering and it is in its experience.
Can you?
Say, when you ask me, am I suffering? I'm saying yes.
Yeah.
But the Suman is also a phantom being.
No, except that you have. Actually, I can't tell, right? But I know that I have first-person awareness, right? Do you see what I mean? Yeah. Right. I don't know for sure that you do, and you could be in my dream. If I'm an extreme Advaitin, I might believe that. But the point is, this is the claim that even Sankhya will make the same claim, is that no matter how sophisticated AI becomes, it can never become conscious. This is Vedanta and Sankhya agree on this. It'll never become conscious. It can behave so identically with a conscious being that we can't it's like we're talking, the AI robot looks like a human being, talks like a human being, seems to suffer like a human being, and yet, at the end of the day, there's still no consciousness behind it. That's the Indian spiritual approach. Yeah? Okay. Now, I wanted to read to you Swami Vivekananda's commentary because it's very beautiful. He also kind of touches on this difficult problem of who exactly is bound and liberated. And he then beautifully ties in the whole discussion to spiritual practice. One of my favorite passages, which I read before joining the order, and I found it very inspiring. So I'm going to read to you parts of his commentary in 2.18. He says, Swamiji says, "What is the purpose of the whole of nature? That the Purusha may gain experience. The Purusha has, as it were, forgotten its mighty godly nature. There is a story that the king of the gods, Indra, once became a pig, wallowing in mire. He had a she-pig and a lot of baby pigs and was very happy. Then some god saw his plight and came to him and told him, 'You are the king of the gods. You have all the gods under your command. Why are you here?' But Indra said, 'Never mind, I am all right here. I do not care for heaven while I have this sow and these little pigs.' The poor gods were at their wits' end. After a time, they decided to slay all the pigs, one after another. When all were dead, Indra began to weep and mourn. Then the gods ripped his pig body open, and he came out of it and began to laugh when he realized what a hideous dream he had had. He, the king of the gods, to have become a pig, and to think that that pig life was the only life. Not only so, but to have wanted the whole universe to come into the pig life. The Purusha, when it identifies itself with nature, forgets that it is pure and infinite." So notice the language here. Swamiji is trying to be sympathetic to the system, the Sankhya, because he's giving a commentary on the Yoga Sutra. But if you look at his lectures on Sankhya and Vedanta, he also points out that they run into problems. Okay, then he says, "The Purusha does not love, it is love itself. It does not exist, it is existence itself." Sounds a lot like Advaita Vedanta, right? Okay, then he says, "It appears to have become so degenerate that if you approach to tell it, you are not a pig, it begins to squeal and bite." He was a great prose stylist, actually, to the point where Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian novelist, he read this book, Raja Yoga, and he said that Swami Vivekananda was a master of English prose. Then it comes to a crescendo in this last paragraph. "Thus is it with us all in this Maya, this dream world, where it is all misery, weeping, and crying, where a few golden balls are rolled, and the world scrambles after them. You were never bound by laws. Nature never had a bond for you. That is what the yogi tells you. Have patience to learn it. And the yogi shows how, by junction with nature and identifying itself with the mind and the world, the Purusha thinks itself miserable. Then the yogi goes on to show you that the way out is through experience. Bhoga, that bhoga in the sutra. You have to get all this experience, but finish it quickly. We have placed ourselves in this net and will have to get out. We have got ourselves caught in the trap and we will have to work out our freedom. So get this experience of husbands and wives and friends and little loves. You will get through them safely if you never forget what you really are. Never forget this is only a momentary state and that we have to pass through it. Experience is the one great teacher, experience of pleasure and pain. But know it is only experience. It leads step by step to that state where all things become small, and the Purusha so great that the whole universe seems as a drop in the ocean and falls off by its own nothingness. We have to go through different experiences, but let us never forget the ideal. It's a very powerful commentary. Okay, so
The pig in the story.
can you get the mic to? I know you love the mic.
I was just saying that the pig in the story doesn't have to remember anything. It gets lucky and the gods come to its rescue. So it's much easier if you have, like, in my personal view, it'd be much nicer if the gods come to rescue me than if I do all the effort to get there. So do you have to do the effort, or do you, can you rely on the gods to come find you?
Yeah, there's, Sri Ramakrishna would say, the breeze of God's grace is always blowing, but in order to take advantage of that breeze, what do you have to do? You have to set the sail. And so there's a kind of interplay between self-effort and grace going on here, I think. And who are those gods who come and, cut open the pig's body and all that? Your guru, God, coming to these classes, and so on. Yeah. We're spiritual butchers. Okay. All right. So we've got 2 more sutras to cover. Let's try to do that. Okay. 2.19. So remember, 2.18 is starting to explain the nature of the scene, the side of insentient nature. 2.19 continues. And it uses these very technical terms. Okay. So please repeat after me. 2.19. Vishesha, Avishesha, Alingamatra, Alingani, Gunaparvani. Okay, Bryant's translation. The different stages of the guna qualities consist of the Vishesha, particularized. See, I'm using these words up here. Vishesha, Avishesha, okay? So, Bryant is translating Vishesha as particularized. And Avishesha as unparticularized. Okay. So, Avishesha, unparticularized. And then Linga is distinctive. And then Alinga is indistinctive. Okay, so in a single sutra, 2.19, what we get is the entire cosmology of Sankhya and Yoga. The entire cosmology in these 4 terms. Okay? So, how does this work? Well, if you go way back to the beginning of our class, page 50, Roman numeral 50, because it's in the introduction, there's a diagram of the cosmology of Sankhya. Okay? And now, in that diagram, it looks like this, if you can see it. Okay? So I've kind of done a schematic version of it. So now, in this diagram, so of course Purusha is missing. That's the whole point, because Purusha is conscious. That's the only conscious entity. This is insentient nature, okay? I need the mic here, so yeah, right, okay. Otherwise nobody's gonna... Okay. So, now, here's what it does. With these 4 terms, it's explaining this entire cosmology, okay? And so this every term or every item or every member of this, okay, every item in this cosmology falls into one of these 4 categories, okay? Okay, so here's how it works. Particularized means, Vishesha means, it's not the cause of any further effects. It's just the buck stops there. The buck stops there. Do you see? You see how it stopped? Like with Mahabhutas, they're Vishesha. Why? because the 5 gross elements don't then generate anything further. Okay? But the tanmatras, the 5 tanmatras, the subtle elements, are avishesha. They're not vishesha, they're avishesha, unparticularized. Why? Because they produce the 5 mahabhutas. Okay, now here. All of these, manas, the 5 senses of cognition, and the 5 senses of action, all vishesha, all particularized. Why? Because the buck stops there. Nothing further issues from either mind or from the sense of cognition or from the sense of action. But who is the father, the parent of these 3 things? Ahankara, which means it's avishesha because it gives rise to all these things actually. Manas, the sense of cognition, the sense of action, and the tanmatras, which means that ahankara, egoism, the I sense, has to be avishesha. It has to be unparticularized. Okay? Those are the first 2 terms in the sutra. And then the other 2 terms, linga and alinga. Linga refers to the buddhi. Linga literally means mark. And some of you probably are aware of the fact that the subtle body in Sanskrit, there are 2 terms usually used. The more common one is sukshma sharira, sukshma sharira. As opposed to, what's the gross body? Very good, exactly. Stula sharira. So the sukshma sharira would be the subtle body, but there's another term for the subtle body, linga sharira. Did any of you know that? Linga sharira, yeah. It's a pretty common term. So it could be that this link with linga is in that sense too, because this is the subtle body. But it literally means mark or sign, linga, okay? And then prakriti is alinga. And the way that Bryant translates this is indistinctive, or like it has no mark, no sign. Okay? And what's the reason? It's pretty obvious. Because it's unmanifest nature. It's avyakta. It's completely unmanifest. It's not perceivable in any way. Neither is buddhi, actually, but it gets a little complicated. There's actually some discussion of why exactly is the buddhi called linga. We don't need to go into these technical, frankly, kind of boring discussions. But very elegantly, this one sutra captures the entire cosmology and puts every term, every item in this cosmology into one of these 4 categories. Okay, that's the thing to keep in mind. And what's the whole point of this? The overarching purpose is, what exactly is the nature of this scene that we keep confusing ourselves with? Right? And it consists of all of nature, and what is part of that nature? My physical body, and even my mind. And it's because I mistakenly identify with this body-mind complex that I suffer. That's the whole overarching idea. Okay. So I'm skipping a lot here. Okay, I'll read one paragraph here because it's important. 221 from Bryant's commentary in 2.19. Bryant says, quoting various passages from the Vedanta Sutras, the Brahma Sutras, Vijnana Bhikshu, so one of these later commentaries on the Yoga Sutras, takes this opportunity to distinguish the philosophy of the Yoga school from that of the Advaita, non-dualist Vedantic school founded by Shankara. That's a bit of a mistake here. Shankara did not found the school of Advaita Vedanta. We don't know who the founder was, but we definitely know that there was somebody who preceded him. Who was that? Gaudapada, exactly. Because he composed Mandukya, which is extant. So Shankara was definitely not the founder, but we can say that he was the codifier and the greatest exponent, or one of the greatest exponents of Advaita Vedanta, and someone who, because he wrote the commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra, he made it a bona fide Vedantic school in the Vedantic tradition. Okay, so then, Bryant says, the Advaita school posits that Prakriti, the gunas, and the entirety of the manifest world are all ultimately not real, but are mental constructions produced by ignorance, superimpositions on the only real existent Brahman. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya is this classic formula of Advaita Vedanta. Brahman alone is real, everything else is an illusion. Okay. Outlining the position of the yoga school, Vijnana Bhikshu stresses that the world in its essence, prakriti, is real and eternal. So this is real. There's nothing illusory about this world in Sankhya and yoga philosophy. And therefore, the evolutes from this matrix, the world, are also in this sense real, albeit temporary and constantly changing, mutating, and eventually dissolving back into their source. All of this is also real. Because Prakriti is real, everything else is also real. But there's a difference between Prakriti and everything else. Prakriti is eternal. Prakriti is eternal. Are you following? Even though it's insentient, it's nature. Just like, this table in a certain sense, the table as table is not eternal, but the stuff of which the table is made is eternal. It's the law of the conservation of energy and so on, right? It'll just keep converting, it'll keep changing its form, but it doesn't disappear, right? So Prakriti is eternal in that sense, but these things are not eternal because they're not permanently stable. They'll eventually dissolve again. Back into what? Into Prakriti. That's the idea, okay? Okay, and then he says, he quotes the well-known verse from the Chandogya Upanishad in reference to objects made out of clay, which we call pots or plates, etc., out of convenience, but which remain essentially clay. Quote, by means of just one lump of clay, one can perceive everything made out of clay. The transformation is just a verbal handle, a name, vacha arammanam namadhyam, while the reality is just this, it is clay. So then Bryant says, the manifestations of Brahman are not false, Vijnana Bhikshu argues, contra Shankara, any more than the modifications of clay are false, but they are temporary. So I like this, especially this bringing in this Chandogya metaphor, because I do it myself all the time. I've got a whole class from a couple of years ago, I think you attended it, called Much Ado About Clay Pots. And I bring it up constantly. And what's the idea? Well, if you look at the Upanishads and the kind of metaphors it uses to explain the nature of this world in relation to Brahman, it's using realist metaphors. It's not using the rope snake metaphor that Shankara was so fond of. It's not likening this world to a dream or to a mirage in a desert. That's another thing that Shankara would use, another analogy he would use. No, he says, this world comes from Brahman in the way that clay pots are fashioned out of clay. But does it make any sense to say that the clay pot is an illusory appearance of the clay? No. It's a real manifestation. It's a real formation. And Vijnana Bhikshu is using, and he's also emphasizing the fact that, he's highlighting the fact that if you go to the Vedantic scriptures, they're using metaphors that support the reality of the world. Temporary, sure. The clay pots are temporary. You can break them, they'll disintegrate, but they're real. That's the idea. Okay, and so he's supporting a kind of realist metaphysics as opposed to Shankara's classical Advaitic non-realist metaphysics. Okay, now we can move on to, one thing I should just mention quickly is that these terms that Bryant uses for the four terms, that he uses to translate them, particularized, unparticularized, and then distinctive, indistinctive. Swamiji, I just want to share his terms. Swamiji uses the terms defined. Vishesha is defined. Avishesha is undefined. Okay. And then linga, Swamiji translates as the indicated only. And then alinga as the signless. It's very literal as a translation, the signless. But it means it's completely avyakta, it's completely unmanifest. That's the idea. Okay. And I wanted to read out to you a very interesting passage from his commentary on 2.19. Remember, look at this part of the cosmology. 5 tanmatras, subtle elements, giving rise to the 5 mahabhutas, the gross elements, okay? And, okay, now focusing on that, Swamiji says, now we shall understand the aphorism that the states of the qualities are defined, undefined, indicated only, and signless. Vishesha, avishesha, linga, alinga. By the defined, vishesha, are meant the gross elements, which we can sense. By the undefined, avishesha, are meant the very fine materials, the tanmatras, which cannot be sensed by ordinary men. If you practice yoga, he always brings it back to spiritual practice. That's why I like this. So he says, if you practice yoga, however, says Patanjali, after a while, your perceptions will become so fine that you will actually see the tanmatras. You can literally see even these subtle elements through yogic practice. For instance, you have heard how every man has a certain light about him. Every living being emits a certain light. And this, he says, can be seen by the yogi. We do not all see it, but we all throw out these tanmatras, just as a flower continuously sends out fine particles which enable us to smell it. Every day of our lives, we throw out a mass of good or evil, and everywhere we go to the atmosphere, and everywhere we go to, the atmosphere is full of these materials. That is how there came to the human mind, unconsciously, the idea of building temples and churches. See how his mind works. He's extremely original. Okay, why should man build churches in which to worship God? Why not worship him anywhere? Why are we sitting here now? Even if he did not know the reason, man found that the place where people worshipped God became full of good tanmatras. Every day people go there, and the more they go, the holier they get, and the holier that place becomes. If any man who has not much sattva in him goes there, the place will influence him and arouse his sattva quality. Here, therefore, is the significance of all temples and holy places. But you must remember that their holiness depends on holy people congregating there. The difficulty with man is that he forgets the original meaning and puts the cart before the horse. It was men who made these places holy, and then the effect became the cause and made men holy. If the wicked only were to go there, it would become as bad as any other place. It is not the building, but the people that makes a church. And that is what we always forget. That is why sages and holy persons who have much of this sattva quality can send it out and exert a tremendous influence day and night on their surroundings. A man may become so pure that his purity will become tangible. Whosoever comes in contact with him becomes pure. So I really like this commentary explaining the practical importance of understanding tanmatras as avishesha. Okay, now let's discuss 2.20. Please repeat after me. Drashta drishimatraha shuddhopi pratyaya anupashyaha. Okay, the drashta, the seer, is merely the power of seeing. However, although pure, shuddha api, he witnesses the images of the mind, pratyaya anupashyaha. Okay, so you can see already, 2.20 is again going to open that can of worms, my favorite can of worms. Okay, so he says, the seen, the gunas of Prakriti and their effects, has been discussed in the above sutras, in the previous two sutras, 2.18 and 2.19. And now, Patanjali turns his attention to the seer, drashtar. The seer is the Purusha, the soul or innermost conscious self. He is the pure, undiluted power of consciousness, pure because untouched by any attribute, qualification, object, or predicate. Again, sounds a lot like Advaita Vedanta in many ways. What's one of the main differences? In Advaita Vedanta, the self is non-dual, that pure consciousness is non-dual. Whereas in Sankhya and Yoga, there are many Purushas. Okay. He is neither the same as, nor, at least when embodied, totally different from buddhi, intelligence, insofar as his knowledge of Prakriti arises from his awareness of buddhi. Okay, this gets kind of interesting because the commentators point out that there's somehow an intimacy between Purusha and buddhi. Or maybe that's not quite right. An intimacy, as it were, or something, or like a perceived intimacy between Purusha and buddhi, because in fact they're completely unconnected and unrelated. Okay, but he talks about this at length. Okay, let me give you an example. So he says in the next paragraph, this is page 222 of Bryant's commentary. Purusha is not the same as buddhi because buddhi has external things, cows, pots, etc., as its object of attention, and is therefore always changing, while Purusha is unchanging and has only buddhi as the object of its attention. Moreover, buddhi exists solely for the sake of Purusha, while Purusha exists for its own sake only. Finally, buddhi is inert, unconscious, and composed of the three gunas, whereas Purusha is the active spectator, the source of consciousness, and beyond the three gunas. On the other hand, Purusha is not totally distinct from buddhi in practice, because even though Purusha, here, note this, even though Purusha is pure and self-contained in essence, by witnessing the transformations of buddhi in the form of thoughts and cognitions, pratyayas, etc., it appears as if those thoughts pertain to Purusha itself. So those cognitive functions going on at the level of buddhi, which is strictly insentient, it seems to be conscious. It's like these AI robots which seem conscious, but they seem conscious to us. See, when we interact with ChatGPT, and now there are all sorts of cases of people even committing suicide and going off the deep end. But why? Because we think that, or some people think that they're actually conscious, okay? But that makes sense because we are conscious. Do you see? So now here the problem is, look at the formulation again. It appears as if those thoughts pertain to Purusha itself. Again, notice the passive voice. It appears to whom? Every time we end up with the same difficulty here. To whom does it appear as if thoughts pertain to Purusha itself? To the buddhi? How can it be? Because the buddhi is not conscious. To the Purusha? How can it be? Purusha is eternally liberated. Again, the same problem. Again and again, we come up against that same problem. So then, he continues. It appears as if those thoughts pertain to Purusha itself, that they are Purusha rather than the flickerings of an external and inert but subtle substance. Purusha sees its reflection in the mirror of buddhi, say the commentators. So these commentators are using one metaphor after another to try to explain this paradox. Purusha sees its reflection in the mirror of buddhi, say the commentators, and the mind mistakes this reflection in the mirror, which is distorted due to the transformations of the gunas, to be the real self. Purusha does not change or transform, buddhi does. Again, the language here seems very tortuous to me, and then again, and now here he's saying the mind mistakes this reflection in the mirror. Is the mind the buddhi? But then again, you get the same problem. It's on the side of insentient nature again. What exactly is this mind? Okay. And then again, therefore it is said, says Vyasa, although Purusha is the experiencer and does not change or pursue the objects of the senses, it appears to do so by its identification with the transformations of buddhi. Its identification. So now the Purusha misidentifies with the buddhi, but the Purusha can't. I mean, that's Swamiji used that kind of language because that's what the commentators say. But again, Purusha is eternally liberated, so it can't be making that mistake. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot more of these kinds of issues, but I'll just flag one more thing. Page 224. He says, not only does Purusha appear changed due to this symbiosis, but inert buddhi appears to be conscious due to being energized by consciousness. Continues Vijnana Bhikshu. Just as sunlight, so notice another metaphor, just as sunlight falling on the sea makes the sea appear to be luminous like the sun. But again, notice the metaphor here. When we see a sea illuminated by sunlight and we think that it's bright and active and possibly even conscious, it's us because we're conscious beings looking at it and making that mistake, right? How does that work in the context of Sankhya philosophy? Because notice again, buddhi, inert buddhi appears to be conscious. To whom? To whom does buddhi appear to be conscious? Purushas can never be subject to ignorance. It can never make that mistake. And buddhi is not the kind of thing that can have first person conscious awareness. It can make a mistake in the sense of like a cognitive, like the way that ChatGPT makes a mistake. It makes plenty of mistakes. They're called hallucinations, right? But there's no first person consciousness behind it. Whereas what Sankhya is claiming is that there is. If we didn't feel that we're bound and that we suffer, no purpose in spiritual life, we would never be drawn to spiritual life in the first place. It's because we feel a lack, because we feel that we suffer, that we're missing something, that life could be better, and that we want something better. That's why we take the spiritual life. But why would something insentient ever do that? It wouldn't make any sense, right? Okay. So, any questions? We've covered the 3 sutras. No questions? Any online questions? Okay, well, yeah, Leela has a question.
Isn't the Sukshma Sharira the carrier of emotions?
See, emotions can only be felt by an embodied being. Okay, so you wouldn't have emotions after you leave the body in the same way that we have now. So it's when the subtle body is associated with the grossly physical body, and with animated by the jivatma behind it, a conscious soul. That's when we have feelings, it seems to me.
Okay, so then in relationship to the ahankara, which is actually
the I sense.
taking
Exactly. This I, you need the ahankara. Yeah, but the I sense itself is also still insentient, though. The I sense animated by or appearing to be animated by the conscious soul, the purusha, behind it. In Vedanta, it's called the jivatma.
Okay, so but buddhi still has the ability to make changes to itself.
It's got all, just as ChatGPT has all the things it can do. It can make calculations, it can do this, it can think, it can blah, 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 right, in exactly that way.
But that's why I'm thinking there needs to be a connection to the idea of a jivatma within the buddhi. Because the ability to be able to translate the idea of emotion needs to center in the buddhi so that the ego will make that distinction.
But the whole problem is that in Sankhya, this is insentient. There's no room for a conscious entity there, right? And so that's why we always run into the same problems. Yeah. Your head's spinning. Okay. Anyone else? And anything online?
ChatGPT is coming for you.
I know. It's getting creepier and creepier by the day. Yeah. But thankfully, we'll never be conscious. At least that's what Vedantins promise.
We got one for you online.
Okay, we got one question online.
Doesn't the false identification lie with the ahamkara, which is part of prakriti? Of course, it is insentient, but doesn't it get lit up by the energy of the purusha?
Yeah, right, exactly. So this is the standard explanation: is that it's the ego or the buddhi that makes the mistake of identifying with the body-mind complex. And it makes the mistake because it's animated by or seems to be made conscious because of the presence of or the conjunction with purusha. And I address that very objection in the book, and I read it to you. Let me just see. What exactly does activation or illumination mean? And how is it even possible within the framework of Sankhya metaphysical dualism? So what is it? See, it's a metaphor for the conscious purusha to activate or to make buddhi appear conscious. It's a kind of metaphor. How is it even possible within the framework of Sankhya metaphysical dualism? And to whom does the subtle body seem to be conscious when it is illuminated by purusha? This is really important. So for the questioner here, to whom does the subtle body seem to be conscious when it is illuminated by purusha? Who's the one that's fooled here? I don't think there's any coherent answer from the Sankhya Yoga standpoint, to be honest. Okay? All right. I think we can end on that provocative note. Think about it for yourselves and see whether, there's one person at least who loves this Bryant's textbook, and every time I give these classes, he's like, you're too hard on Bryant. It's not about Bryant, I'm too hard on Sankhya maybe, and yoga. But defend Sankhya, try to defend Sankhya for me. And say, no, there's a simple answer, you're missing something, duh, come on. All right, and one more time, I'm just gonna mention the next 3 classes, the 3 classes in September 4th, September 11th, September 25th. Our next class is Thursday, September 4th. The assignment is to read 2.21 to 23 of the Yoga Sutras, pages 225 to 232 of Bryant's text. Thank you very much. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.